How you doing, guys? BC90 here with the next video in my Poise Showcase series, and today I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. Today I'm going to try and put everything that I know about the new Poise mechanics and how to utilize them after the 1.08 patch into one video. One of my YouTube viewers actually made a comment asking me if I could do this, so I'm doing it now. I'm going to attempt to put all my knowledge into one video, and just straight off the bat I just want to put out there, guys, that I'm by no means the Poise expert or the Poise god or whatever. I'm essentially going off two major sources. That's Big Hat Logan's Poise video, which was discusses Poise post the 1.08 patch, and also the refined Poise calculator version 1.22 by user Sir Halvard that you can download off Reddit. Now those are my two sources that I basically base all my videos on, and I've done extensive testing using these two sources, so I can basically say that they're pretty much fairly accurate. These systems, they haven't let me down yet, so they are fairly accurate. But in saying that, if you feel that I have missed something or I have said something incorrectly, obviously, then please put that in the comment section below, as obviously I'm trying to be as accurate as possible, and I'd obviously be looking to improve that in my next videos. Now first, let's talk about Poise itself in this game. Now obviously in the original Dark Souls, all you needed to do was stack the base Poise value you get from armor to be able to just tank your opponent's attacks, without having to worry about hyper armor and framing, active framing, etc. But in Dark Souls 3, you need more than that. So essentially, in this game, Poise activates based on three contingencies working together. Now the first one is your base Poise value that you get from armor, and if you go into your menu, that'll be on the bottom right there where it says Poise. So the first contingency is your base Poise that you get from your armor, stacked over a certain breakpoint, which is a flat number depending on the weapon class that you use and what weapon classes and attacks you want to be able to hyper armor through. Now the second contingency is two-handing a heavy weapon with enough hyper armor. So for example, an ultra greatsword, a great axe, or a great hammer, as these are the easiest to optimize for. Now these, you get two-handed swings from these weapon classes will stack with your base Poise value. Okay. Now, the third contingency that needs to be working with these other two synergistically is active framing. So active framing is essentially timing that your opponent hits you when you're almost at mid-swing in active frames. So to break it down for you as simply as possible, your attacks have basically three attack windows, and I'm not going to go too in depth here because Big Hat Logan actually covers this in a lot more depth, but to break it down as simply as I can, you have your startup frames, your active frames, and your recovery frames. So your startup frames are the start of your swing, your active frames are basically almost mid-swing or during mid-swing, and your recovery frames is that small window of time between attacks, so where you recover from one attack and go into the next attack. Now, Poise activates in this game when you have, obviously, that base Poise value stacked over a certain breakpoint, you're using a weapon with enough hyper armor, and you're active framing. And that will actually let you consecutively hyper armor trade against your opponent's attacks without staggering yourself. Now keep in mind that if your opponent hits you when you're in startup or recovery frames, even if they're using something like a dagger, they will still stagger you. So essentially you need to be in active frames for this system to work. So you always need to be looking to time that your opponent hits you while you're basically almost at mid-swing. And this will activate what I like to call the hyper armor freight train, where you'll be able to consecutively tank through them and hit them for 2 to 3 hits, before they're able to roll away, essentially. Now, going back to the breakpoint system, okay? You need to stack your base Poise in this game in order to reach these breakpoints if you want to activate Poise, as all these systems have to work synergistically. Alright? So I'm going to be talking about 3 weapon classes here. So, great hammers, ultra great swords, and great axes. The reason why I'm talking about these 3 is because these 3 weapon classes are the easiest to optimize for. they're the weapons that you'll see the most results from, so you'll really be able to see these systems working using these weapons. And on top of that, these are the weapon classes that all my videos focus on. I prefer heavier weapon classes, and they are, obviously very easy to optimize for. So I'll start off with great hammers, and just to let you guys know, I'm going to put all these values in the description if you want to have a look at that and try these breakpoints out for yourself. It'll all be in the description section. So firstly, great hammers. Now, if you want to be able to consecutively hyper armor trade against every single two-handed R1 in the game using a great hammer or two-handing a great hammer, you need to have your base poise stacked over 45.85. Okay, and the key word there is consecutive, because if you're looking to just tank your opponent's first hit, which is called individual hyper armor, then obviously you need less poise. You only need 32.31. But my build's focused on consecutive tanking. Okay, it's the closest that you're going to get to that Dark Souls 1 feel of just consecutively swinging and not staggering against your opponent. Okay, so I'm going beyond individual hyper armor. I want to optimize to the maximum possible poise that I will need using these weapons to consecutively tank. So with great hammers, to tank every two-handed R1 in the game, it's 45.85. Now if you think that that's too high, because obviously with these builds you need a very big vitality investment. As you can see here, my vitality is at 54, and I've also got a Ring of Favor +2 and a Havel's +2. In order to have the heavy armor, the heavy weapon, and have some versatility with lighter weapons, crossbows, whatever. I mean, if you don't want to be, if you're not aiming to optimize to tank against every single weapon class in the game, then obviously you can go for less. So if you're using a great hammer and you want to be able to just trade up to and including ultra great swords, great axes, and curved great swords, that breakpoint reduces to 38.86. And remember, keyword there is consecutive. So you'll be able to consecutively hyper armor against everything up to and including those weapon classes, except for great hammers, obviously. So that was 38.86. Okay, so ultra great swords, great axes, curved great swords, if you're using a great hammer. Now, if you think that's even too much for you, and you don't want to invest in that much vitality, I mean, you prefer to have, your strength at 66, for example, to get maximum damage output, then you'll go below those classes onto regular great swords. So using a great hammer, if you want to tank against or consecutively tank against every weapon class up to and including regular great swords, you only need 29.80 base poise. And then going down from there, regular hammers, you only need 24.18. And the great thing here is for every other weapon class below that, so all faster weapon classes, so that's your short swords, your long swords, well, straight sword classes I should say, daggers, hand axes, katanas, spears. The poise value there that you need is actually negligible, which is to say that it's so small that you don't need to worry about it at all. So essentially, if you're using a great hammer and you just want to be able to tank against fast weapon classes, so everything, excluding hammers and above, or excluding regular hammers and above, you don't even have to worry about this system. You're not going to need to be stacking base poise over any defined breakpoint, because you're already going to be able to hyper armor or consecutively hyper armor against those fast weapons. Okay, but yeah, that basically breaks it down for the great hammer class. Okay, and again, if this is difficult to understand, it's in written form in the description, so have a look at that in the description section below. Now, moving on for great hammers, which I've mentioned in my previous videos that are the easiest weapon classes to optimize for, you have your ultra great swords, which I have one here, and your great axes. Now I'm going to talk about ultra great swords and great axes together because, funnily enough, the breakpoints for ultra great swords and great axes are the same. So if you choose to have an ultra great sword or great axe, you'll adhere to the same breakpoints. So essentially, for these weapon classes, it's a little bit harder to optimize for if you want to be able to consecutively hyper armor against everything. So, if you're using an ultra great sword or a great axe, and you want to be able to consecutively hyper armor trade against every two-handed R1 in the game, including the great hammer class, you need a base poise of 52. Now 52 is difficult to reach, but it's not impossible. I've showed that off before in previous videos. So essentially, you basically need almost full Havels, and let's see here. we'll get a wolf ring +2, and there you go, 52.35. Okay, so it's definitely achievable, but you essentially do need the wolf ring +2 and almost full havels to be able to reach that 52 breakpoint, and that'll allow you to tank everything in the game, including those great hammers. Now, if you don't want to do that, I mean, if you're not interested in tanking against great hammers, because, you know, let's face it, you don't really see too many great hammers in PvP at this point, then instead you're aiming to tank against everything up to and including ultra great swords, great axes, and curved great swords. You need to optimize at 45.81 base poise, or above 45.81 base poise. This is using an ultra great sword or a great axe. Okay. Now, if you don't care about optimizing for those weapon classes either, and you'd rather just go up to and including regular greatswords, using an ultra greatsword or great axe, you only need 37.78 base poise. And going even further down from that, against regular hammers, up to and including regular hammers, it's 32.80 base poise. And again, just like the great hammer class, against all those faster weapons, it's negligible. You don't really have to worry at all about stacking your base poise if all you aim to tank against is those faster weapons. Now, I might quickly mention this, guys, that this breakpoint system, these flat numbers, etc., that you need to, optimize for if you want to be able to consecutively hyper armor trade, these fluctuate based on different attacks. Okay, so what this essentially means is, for example, I'm using an ultra greatsword here. My base poise is at 48.20. I'm fighting a great hammer class. Oh shit, I can't hyper armor through that class. Well, you can and you can't. So essentially, if your opponent with the Great Hammer is approaching you with their regular two-handed R1 attacks, and you're also doing the same, they're going to out-poise you, out-hyper armor you, and they're going to cause you to stagger. Now, if your opponent came after you using their regular two-handed R1 Great Hammer attacks, and you respond with a charged R2 using your Great Sword, then you'll be able to actually hyper armor through that or poise through that. Why? Because already your breakpoint here is above 45.81. Okay, so it's still quite high, and on top of that, the R2 attack, or the charge R2 attack, gives you more hyper armor than a regular two-handed R1 would. So I have actually demonstrated this with the Yorm's Great Machete in one of my previous videos, where I fought a Great Hammer, or a Great Club, and he attacked me with his regular two-handed R1s, and I was able to tank through his attacks using the R2 attack of the Yorm's Great Machete. I didn't stagger, and I was able to poise through it. So essentially, if you use an attack that has more hyper armor than your opponent's attack, and it's also stacking with your base poise value, you'll be able to hyper armor against that other attack, obviously, because you're using an attack that gives you more hyper armor. Now, this is also true for weapon arts. So obviously, if your opponent's approaching you with a Great Hammer and two-handed R1s, and you go and do your weapon art, obviously that's going to give you a massive amount of hyper armor. You're going to be able to poise through it. So I mean, it's a very fluctuating system in that regard, I guess. It's not all clear cut. I mean, if you just want to be able to use those two-handed R1s and tank against everything in the game consecutively, obviously these breakpoints are very useful to be able to do that. But if you're an experienced player or a smart player, you can read the game effectively. I mean, you don't need to be able to go. I mean, you don't need to go that high, essentially, with base poise optimization. I mean, you can meet these guys in combat, these Great Hammer users, for example, using an Ultra, and hit them with R2s or charged R2s, you know, if you time correctly, etc. But, you know, my builds focus on, obviously, max poise optimization, so I'm going to be telling you guys what you need to do using, you know, these particular weapon classes to be able to consecutively hyper armor trade against, you know, the greatest variety of other weapon classes in the game. So obviously I'm going to be aiming for the highest possible stacking of base poise, plus, you know, the hyper armor of that respective weapon class, and active framing. So essentially that's pretty much it. That breaks it down as simply as I can, only focusing on those three weapon classes. And I'm going to say it here, it's, for me personally, it's because they're the easiest weapons to optimize for. As soon as you start using curved greatswords, regular greatswords, and anything below, the poise values become ridiculously high to hit. And essentially it's you're not going to be able to tank everything in the game, and you know, in my opinion, it's not worth it. I mean, if you're going to go for a Poise build, you want to be using these heavier weapon classes so you can get the maximum enjoyment out of the system. You can get that as close to a feel as possible as that Dark Souls 1 Poise. Obviously, it's not the same, it's vastly different, but you know, the closest feel you'll get is using these systems synergistically and, you know, having these breakpoints in place and sticking to them. Okay, guys? So, great hammers, ultra great swords, great axes, and obviously those 3 factors that activate Poise. So that basically breaks it down in a nutshell, as simply as I can, you know, put it into words, I guess. But like I said, if I've missed anything, any important points you feel I should have discussed, please put them in the comments section below. Or if you feel that something was off, or you know, you think that you know, the breakpoints are off or whatever, for example, then please let me know. But also, if you can, please include your source, because I'm trying to be as accurate as possible with the Poise mechanics here post the 1.08 patch, so I can make these videos and keep the community informed. So I'd like to get the most accurate information possible, essentially. So you know, if you do refute one of my statements here, I guess, and point to something else, please let me know your source so I can have a look at it and start playtesting. Okay, guys? Anyways, I have playtested, you know, these 2 sources and these systems extensively on this channel, and I haven't been disappointed yet, which is to say these systems haven't failed me, and these 2 sources have been quite accurate. So there is that. And I do encourage you guys to try it, because it's incredible fun. You'll have a lot of fun doing this, guys. Now, one last thing I might add, the Ring City is very close now. I can't wait to play it, and I had a look at the patch notes the other day for the incoming balance patch, the big balance patch that's coming, and there were a couple things that stood out there which were pretty cool, and one that has me a little bit worried. So essentially, I read that ultra great swords, great axes, and great hammers are going to get, I think it was a speed buff, making their attacks a little bit quicker, I think. Now that could mean either the attack is quicker off the ground, or maybe they've just increased the active frames in those attack windows. So I don't know that yet because the patch isn't out, but that sounds pretty cool on paper. On top of that, these 3 weapon classes, or these heavier weapon classes, are actually going to be easier to manage in terms of stamina. So they're actually reducing the stamina cost of using these weapons in terms of attacks, which is awesome. So I'm going to have a lot of fun testing that out. Additionally, the pickaxe, which is the only great hammer in its class that can actually be parried when two-handed, is actually getting buffed. So that's no longer going to be able. That's no longer going to be true, essentially. So finally, the pickaxe is going to be in line with every other weapon in its class, and it's going to be unparryable in its two-handed R1 attacks, which is awesome. And the last thing I will note that has me both excited and worried, I guess, is I guess it's a buff to heavy armor. So essentially they're bolstering heavy armor absorption values, which is pretty cool. So you know, these heavy armors are actually going to give you the absorption resistances that you would expect from heavier armor classes. But in order to balance that, they are increasing the weight of these heavy armors. Now, why does that worry me? Because already with these Poise builds, as you can see, if you want to have versatility in these builds to be able to deal with different threats that you fight in the meta, you need a pretty high vitality investment already. Like, look at mine, it's already at 54. And you do pretty much essentially need the Havel's +2 and the Ring of Favor +2 iterations. So it has me a bit concerned. I mean, how much heavier are they going to make these armors? Is it going to really reduce the versatility I get in my builds? Because, you know, as I've mentioned in previous videos, it's quite hard to fight, for example, you know, quick steppers that are constantly trying to backstab you. Sometimes you need a faster weapon to chase your opponents down. Whiff punish, you want to have a crossbow there to surprise your opponents, punish casters, you know, force passive reactive players to be a bit more aggressive, etc. So it's going to be interesting to see how heavy they make these armors and what impact that has on the overall versatility of these builds. But again, the patch hasn't come out, so I can't comment on any of this you know, extensively yet. But I am excited for it. I will be doing a lot of playtesting and further videos, and obviously I'll be doing my playthrough of the Ring City when it comes out, guys. So again, you know, if you enjoyed this video, hit the like button. If you're enjoying my content, please subscribe. And as always, guys, thank you for watching.